Hey folks, I wanted to just talk quickly about why the Sino-Soviet split happened. I know there's a lot of confusion about the Cold War. People aren't exactly clear about why it was that after about 1961, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and China were no longer allies. So I want to explain what happened. Okay. So in 1956, that's a few years after the death of Stalin, Khrushchev assumed the leadership of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had its 20th Party Congress. And Khrushchev he took office, and he used the 20th Party Congress to unload a tirade against Joseph Stalin. And to just accuse Stalin of all kinds of things, of being bad in many ways. Some of it very, very obviously false. For example, he claimed that Stalin was cowardly during the Second World War and was scared, and I mean, that's ridiculous. Stalin was somebody who, he robbed banks at one point. He was a bank robber, robbing banks at gunpoint. He'd fought in the streets. He'd been in armed battles. The idea that he would just be trembling and afraid when he found out the Soviet Union had been invaded by Nazi Germany, something that he'd been basically telling the Soviet population was inevitable for a long time. It's ridiculous. And the secret speech that Khrushchev gave was essentially Khrushchev and the Soviet Union trying to accommodate the United States. They were trying to say, look, Stalin's dead, and we're the new leaders. I, Khrushchev, am the new leader, and we can make peace with the West. We're not gonna antagonize you, so let's stop intensifying the arms race. It was an attempt of the Soviet leaders to kind of tremble before the United States and say, look, don't worry, we're not bad like Stalin. Please don't, escalate the arms race. Please make a deal with us. Please negotiate with us. And the secret speech was a big deal, 1956. And at first, interestingly, China embraced it. And following the secret speech, you had what they called de-Stalinization. And that included the U.S. Communist Party, offering to merge with the Socialist Party of the United States. They published a document called Communists Take a New Look. That involved just a lot of efforts to try and make the world communist movement look not so scary and to try and kind of tone down the radical stuff. And at first, China embraced it. And Mao had in China, they had the 100 Flowers campaign where they said, let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend. And there was just an effort to embrace de-Stalinization. However, part of de-Stalinization was the Soviet Union urging its aligned political parties around the world, especially in the developing world, in places like Africa and Asia and South America and places like that, not to engage in armed struggle. The Soviet Union basically took the position that because the United States has the atomic bomb, because there's a danger of atomic warfare, that people in developing countries like Africa, like South Africa in particular, and other parts of the developing world should not engage in armed revolutionary activities because it was too dangerous because of the Second World War, because of the Cold War. So because of that, and because of the arms race, and because the Soviet Union had this new policy, after a few years, China started loudly disagreeing with the Soviet Union. And at first, they published a document called On the Difference Between Comrade Togliatti and Us, and that was criticizing the Italian Communist Party. They published documents criticizing Yugoslavia. But ultimately, 1961, China came out and they said, look, people in the developing world who are living under brutal U.S.-backed dictatorships, whose countries are being chronically kept in poverty, they have the right to engage in armed struggle. And the Soviet Union is, they said, revisionist. It's revisionist in not supporting people in the developing world that want to fight against imperialism. And that their claim that, it's too dangerous to fight against imperialism, that's a false claim, right? Just because the USA has the atomic bomb, that doesn't make it the ruler of the world. And so on that basis, China positioned itself as a supporter of third world revolution against Western capitalism, whereas the Soviet Union positioned itself as advocating anything in the name of world peace, and basically telling people who are being slaughtered, people who are being killed in the developing world, don't pick up a gun, don't defend yourself against imperialism, because doing so, if you do that, you'll be provoking an arms race, and we have to do everything we can to stop a nuclear war. And China was denouncing the Soviet Union over that. Soviet Union's response was to pull all of its aid out of China. And that had a detrimental effect on China's economy. Buildings were left half-built. Blueprints for buildings were burned, all kinds of aid. The Soviet Union had been helping China to develop its own steel industry, had been building infrastructure, it had been helping China in a lot of ways to pull itself up, and it pulled all of its aid out. And so that economically caused a lot of problems in China. So shortly afterwards, the Chinese Communist Party tried to do the opposite of what the Soviet Communist Party was doing. The Soviet Communist Party was de-Stalinizing and trying to emphasize that they were softening things, they weren't a threat to Western capitalism. So the Chinese Communist Party tried to emphasize that they were the most radical and the most communist and the most anti-imperialist. And that culminated in 1966 with the launching of the Cultural Revolution in China, where essentially Mao and Lin Biao mobilized the young people of China, the students, to form these clubs called Red Guards and go out and basically overthrow the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party and replace it with people that were much more in line with this radical new kind of thinking. It was very violent. It was a big upsurge, millions of people in Chinese society, especially young people, being mobilized. And they did a lot of stuff where they changed the names of streets and they burned ancient temples and old buildings and did everything they could. And that was China's first stage. Eventually, Lin Biao, it's not clear what happened. He betrayed Mao. He tried to escape the Soviet Union. So after Lin Biao, you had the rise of the Gang of Four. And the Gang of Four in China took the anti-Soviet stuff to another level. They started saying that, well, not only is the Soviet Union not revolutionary, but they're actually an imperialist country. And they started saying that the Soviet Union was what they called Soviet social imperialism. And on that basis, in Angola, you had China aligning with the CIA against the socialist MPLA government. In many different parts of the world, South Africa, different places, you had the Chinese-aligned communists aligning with the United States against the pro-Soviet communists. And in places like Ethiopia and other places, that took on a very, very, dark character. And on top of that, you had Richard Nixon, the President of the United States, being welcomed to China as a hero, being given a kind of a hero's reception. You had China no longer supporting the people of Vietnam, and China basically positioning in itself, around the world to align with the United States in the name of being anti-Soviet, right? And that happened, right? And Pinochet, the Pinochet government, was embraced by the Gang of Four government in China. And China, in the name of being ultra-revolutionary, began aligning with the United States against the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, as the 1970s went on, kind of backed into a corner, and to the point that, with Brezhnev, they started doing more radical things that they hadn't done. For a while, they'd been saying, well, they didn't support any armed revolutions around the world, and all things in the interest of world peace. Well, the Soviet Union, as the 1970s progressed, they started supporting, revolts like eventually, happened in South America with the Sandinistas, and in different parts of the world, in Afghanistan and other places. You had the Soviet Union actually moving into a position where it was supporting more communist revolutions, whereas China was opposing anyone that was aligned with the Soviet Union. And it was a pretty big disaster. And ultimately, the Cold War's end, the Cold War's conclusion, probably has a lot more to do with the Sino-Soviet split than anything else. The fact that these two major countries, the biggest country in the world in terms of geography, the Soviet Union, the biggest country in the world in terms of population, China, both of them were led by communist parties, but starting in 1961 and really escalating in 1969 with the rise of the Gang of Four, these two countries, even though they were both communists, even though they were both opposed to Western capitalism, were not on the same side. And in some cases, they were blatantly killing each other, right? You had different parts of the world where the Maoist-aligned Communist Party and the Soviet-aligned Communist Party would actually kill each other. And it was a big disaster, the culmination might be the Kampuchea War, right, where we had Pol Pot, who took power claiming that he was some kind of Maoist, and claiming that he was a pure communist. He was going to implement agrarian communism. They didn't need to have industry in Cambodia, slaughtering the pro-Soviet wing of his own Communist Party, fighting then with Vietnam, then China, led by Deng Xiaoping, invading Vietnam to supposedly protect Kampuchea, and a lot of people dying in Southeast Asia as the communists on one side that are calling themselves Maoists and the communists on the other side that are calling themselves pro-Soviet or Marxist-Leninists killing each other. It was a big disaster, and ultimately China began to shift away from it. I mean, China ultimately still kind of held on to this view that the Soviets were the main enemy up through the 1980s. But China began to shift away from it when they moved away from the concept of poverty communism, right? When they repudiated the Gang of Four that said that you could transition to communism in a stage of poverty. That was the beginning of eventually in the 1990s China becoming friendly with the anti-imperialist countries. China backing away from that. And I know, like in Angola, China has officially apologized to the government of Angola for their support for the so-called Maoists in UNITA. And China at this point is friendly with the socialist countries of the world, friendly with Russia, friendly with Cuba, etc. And the Soviet Union, on top of that, I think it probably played a big role in their ultimate downfall, because at the same time that they were moving away from pushing this radical, position, there was efforts to kind of manipulate the artists and intellectuals of the Soviet Union and play into some of the alienation that they felt, and ultimately by pulling the two biggest socialist countries in the world apart from each other, that was key in ultimately destroying the Soviet Union. It's very fascinating, but a lot of people don't know much about the Sino-Soviet split, but it's very important when you look at it. And there were obviously blame on both sides of it. There were things that the Soviet Union did that were unprincipled. There were things that China did that were unprincipled. Ultimately, the Cold War is over. Right? China has repudiated the Gang of Four and the Cultural Revolution and that ultra-leftist stage. Many people in Russia very strongly disagree with the policies of Khrushchev. I know the Communist Party of the Russian Federation does not honor Khrushchev as a great leader. They're very critical of the role that he played. And ultimately, it's interesting to take note of, but those disagreements in world communism, they weren't just intellectual academic disagreements. They had big geopolitical implications. And it's important to take notice of that. And what's most important is this notion of poverty communism. Communism, that's just everyone being poor, but they share everything. They're just purely egalitarian. This notion that you don't need material abundance to get to a higher stage, that notion of poverty communism is something that Western capitalism and imperialism clung to, right? They were funding Pol Pot. That's very well documented, that Pol Pot was receiving Western support, and in some cases a lot of these Maoist groups that were attacking the Soviet Union were getting some kind of Western backing, and that poverty communism, separating communism from the struggle to raise material abundance, making communism about people being in the woods and being impoverished but sharing everything, almost this hippie vision of, we're doing everything right, man, and no one's, that kind of vision of kind of egalitarian poverty of communism was very, very destructive. At the same time, were bureaucratic efforts to accommodate Western imperialism, telling people in the developing world they don't have the right, even when they're being killed, even when they're, they're being slaughtered, that they don't have the right to pick up a gun and defend themselves and fight for a socialist government in the developing world in conditions of extreme poverty. That kind of bureaucratic attempt to accommodate the West was also problematic. So I think there were problems on both sides, and this is history, right? This is the 20th century. The Cold War is over. But I just wanted to comment on basically why the Sino-Soviet split happened. I think it's important to know.